Al Pacino, the man from the fiery streets of the Bronx who once carried both hunger and burning hope in his chest, rose to become one of the greatest legends in Hollywood. With a face carved by struggle and a voice trembling like a sacred prayer, he didn't just act, he burned. Every glance was a confession, every silence a storm, until the whole world bowed before the man who turned pain into art. From The Godfather to Scent of a Woman. He didn't build a career, he built a cathedral, each brick laid with anger, genius, and the ashes of old wounds. More than an actor, he was a flame that refused to die. But even fire grows weary. Behind every ovation, behind every golden statue, there lived a silence, deep, endless, and waiting for a single voice that could reach him again. Diane Keaton. Born under the soft California sun, raised on dreams and quiet fire, redefined what it means to be imperfect. She turned clumsiness into art and fragility into strength. From Annie Hall to Reds, she gave loneliness a voice and turned truth into beauty. Her laughter could fill a room, but behind it was a stillness so tender it could break your heart without a word. She never chased fame. She was fame itself, proving that sincerity can outshine glamour and that gentleness can be rebellion. She wasn't just a woman. She was a mirror in which the world saw its own humanity reflected through grace and courage. When they met, it wasn't just a love story. It was a miracle. Two restless souls born of different fires dared to meet in the same flame. He was a storm. She was the shelter. And between them burned a love the world mistook for fiction. Though it was destiny written in scars and silence. For 20 long years, their bond endured quietly, hidden beneath fame and time. And now, after her passing, the world waits for Al Pacino to speak, the man to whom she gave her youth, to finally confirm what millions have long believed. If you've ever given your heart and youth to someone you could never forget, leave a light as a tribute to Diane Keaton, the woman who loved with everything she had and hurt just as deeply. Before there was the love story that would leave the world spellbound, beautiful, overwhelming, and forever unfinished, there was only a boy. A boy who learned too early that love can leave, but hunger never does. What shapes a legend is not only talent, but the cruel beginnings he survived. And for Al Pacino, that beginning was carved in absence, hunger, and the kind of pain that teaches a boy to live with ghosts. Alfredo James Pacino was born on April 25, 1940, to a Sicilian family whose dreams were larger than their means. When his father walked away before he could even speak, a wound opened that no applause could ever mend. His mother, Rose, carried him to the South Bronx, where ceilings dripped with cold water and tempers burned hotter than the radiators that never worked. The rent was always late. The winter hallways longer than they should have been. At night he could hear the neighbors arguing through thin walls, love and rage tangled into the same sound. Yet amid that noise, his mother found one small mercy: the movie theater. There, under flickering light and the smell of popcorn and damp wool, the shadows on the screen were kinder than the ones waiting at home. In that darkness, a fragile boy learned that stories could turn loneliness into language. That faces 40 to tall could teach him how to feel when life around him felt too hard to bear. But the Bronx was no cradle. It was a crucible. By 10, he met pain face to face. A fall against an iron fence that tore through his skin and left him crying into the wind. His small hands gripping metal slick with blood, whispering prayers that vanished into the cold. The scar healed, but the helplessness stayed. As he grew, hunger gnawed like a second heartbeat. Some nights' dinner was a piece of bread soaked in watered milk, and he would chew slowly so it lasted longer. His mother would smile and say she wasn't hungry, though he saw the tremor in her hands. The Bronx winters could slice through walls. He'd wake to frost blooming on the inside of the window, trace it with his finger, and pretend it was art. By 13, he was Sonny, a name spoken with affection and warning alike. A restless boy chasing warmth in a world built from cold. Cigarettes and cheap beer offered escape, but every swallow tasted like regret. By 15, rebellion replaced direction. He skipped classes, slammed doors, and mistook defiance for freedom. Without acting, he would later confess, "I might not have made it out." And even then, he already knew how thin the ice was between survival and surrender. At 17, after one last fight with Rose, he walked away from school and straight into the hunger of the streets. He carried groceries for strangers, wiped windshields for coins, and slept beneath windows that leaked the light of other people's lives. Nights bled into mornings, and silence became his only company. 3 of his closest friends, boys who once shared his laughter, his hunger, his borrowed cigarettes, fell to addiction before they were 20. Their funerals were small, their absence enormous. Pacino carried them like ghosts stitched into his ribs, reminders that it could just as easily have been him. "Drugs, alcohol. I probably would have died if I hadn't found acting," he once whispered, not as confession, but survival testimony. Acting didn't make him famous. It kept him alive. Every cold night, every bottle, every bruise became a rehearsal for the man he would become. The Bronx had taught him cruelty, yes, but it also taught him truth, and that truth became his weapon. The terrifying silence of Michael Corleone, the wounded roar of Frank Slade, the haunted grace that made pain look holy. To see Al Pacino only as the legend is to forget the boy he once was, the boy who learned to turn hunger into strength, loss into fuel, rebellion into art. The streets gave him scars, but they also gave him his soul. And from that soul, forged in frost and fire, he built the flame the world still feels today. If Al Pacino's childhood was carved from hunger and survival, Diane Keaton's was shaped by silence. A silence so gentle it almost hid the ache beneath. While his world was filled with noise, hers was built on restraint, and yet both grew up learning the same cruel lesson. That love in its absence can shape a life forever. It's heartbreaking to think that a woman who gave the world so much light began her life in such quiet sorrow. Born on January 5, 1946, beneath the soft glow of Los Angeles, she grew up in Hollywood's shadow, a city obsessed with perfection, where emotion was a weakness to be hidden. Her father, Jack Hall, a decent man of quiet pride, built bridges and boundaries in equal measure. Her mother, Dorothy Diane Keaton Hall, once crowned Mrs. Los Angeles 1955, carried the glow of a dream she was never allowed to live. The applause she longed for was replaced by the hum of domestic chores, the stage lights by the yellow flicker of the kitchen lamp. Inside their tidy house, everything looked fine. 4 children lined up a dinner, smiles practiced, feelings unspoken. But beneath the tablecloth of normally, silence pressed against the walls until even love sounded like restraint. "I grew up in a family that didn't talk about feelings," Diane would later confess. "We simply lived inside them." Those words were not, they were an autopsy of the heart. As a child, she watched her mother's light fade day by day, not in tragedy, but in repetition. Dorothy's life became a slow suffocation. Dishes, schedules, polite laughter, masking the ache of a dream deferred. At 9, Diane stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her mother dry her hands and smile at nothing. "My mother's life was a warning, not a map," she would later write in her memoir, Then Again. That realization did not harden her. It ignited her. While other girls rehearsed their futures as wives, Diane rehearsed her escape. Her rebellion wasn't loud. It was steady. Teachers called her unruly. Classmates whispered strange. But she was already building an identity out of defiance, teaching herself that quiet can be armor and difference can be destiny. "I learned early that if no one hears you," she once said, "you have to become the echo yourself." Her salvation came in high school, under the trembling light of a borrowed stage. She played Blanche Dubois, her voice shaking but alive. And for the first time she felt seen. That night, she said later, the silence finally broke. Acting wasn't escape. It was exorcism. By 20, she packed her life into one small suitcase and left California behind. 2 dresses, a notebook, a name she would soon make immortal. She dropped Hall and took her mother's maiden name, Keaton, a rebellion wrapped in love. Every time they say Miss Keaton, they're saying my mother's name, she whispered once as though still trying to resurrect her. Mother through art. In New York, she studied at the neighborhood playhouse, walking miles between auditions and cheap rented rooms, surviving on coffee, faith, and stubborn grace. The little girl who once drowned in silence became the woman who taught the world to listen. She turned her mother's forgotten dreams into monuments of truth, and through her voice, quivering, brave, unafraid, she gave generations permission to feel, to speak, and to be seen. While Diane Keaton was learning to turn silence into strength, somewhere across the country, another soul was doing the same with fire. If her rebellion was quiet, his was thunder. And from the wreckage of his boyhood rose a flame that refused to die. The flame that would one day set Hollywood alight. He had already walked through the fire of a turbulent youth. But survival alone was never enough. What kept Al Pacino breathing was a dream that mocked his poverty. The belief that a boy from the South Bronx with empty pockets and frost-bitten hands could turn suffering into art. Acting wasn't a fantasy. It was oxygen. And for that breath, he traded sleep for labor, warmth for persistence, pride for the chance to belong. Days blurred into toil, waiting tables until his fingers split, carrying letters through snow so thick it soaked his shoes, scrubbing floors until bleach stung his lungs. His hands were always cold, his meals often air. At night, when the subways fell silent, he'd slip into darkened movie theaters, curling in the back row beneath the flicker of forgotten films. The hum of the projector was lullaby, the spilled popcorn his pillow. When ushers found him at dawn, he'd pretend he'd simply come early for the first showing. Sometimes when the theater was full, the street became his bed. Concrete biting through his coat, rats scurrying close enough to remind him he was still alive. Yet even then, surrender felt colder than the winter wind. By morning he would rise, hollow-eyed, trembling, button broken, and walk miles to HB Studio. There, Charles Elton told him something no one ever had, that the chaos inside him could be sculpted into meaning. Later at the actor's studio, under Lee Strasberg's watchful eye, he discovered that pain could be weaponized. Loneliness could be transmuted into truth. Without acting, he whispered years later, I might not have survived at all. Those were, as he said, nights of hunger followed by mornings of hope, a rhythm that blistered his body but burnished his soul. At 22, the boy who once slept in dark theaters was now reciting Shakespeare by daylight, gaunt, feverish, unstoppable. Friends spoke of how he vanished into rehearsals, rehearsing until his knuckles bled against the stage floor, chasing truth like oxygen. Every rejection, and there were hundreds, drove him deeper into obsession, chiseling art from exhaustion. Then lightning struck. 1968, The Indian Wants the Bronx. The play could have been forgotten like so many others, but his performance set the room ablaze. Critics wrote his name as if it had been waiting for discovery. The Obie Award followed, not a trophy, but proof that the invisible boy from the Bronx had finally been seen. He didn't smile that night. He only whispered to a friend, maybe I'll eat tomorrow. Fate, patient as ever, waited in the wings in the form of Martin Bregman, the man who saw not a novice, but a storm contained in human skin. Together, they began the climb. In 1969, Pacino stormed Broadway with Does a Tiger Wear a Necktie? And left the stage soaked in applause. The Tony Award crowned him, but what mattered more was the symmetry. The boy who once begged warmth from a theater's light now stood illuminated by it. For the first time, he believed the dream was real. Those were the crucible years. Not yet the Godfather, not yet the immortal Michael Corleone, but the forge where discipline met desperation. Every no, every frozen night, every stomach that groaned empty became raw material for the truth that would one day ignite cinema. From the Bronx to Broadway, Al Pacino did not escape poverty. He transformed it. He turned every hunger pang into rhythm, every rejection into strength, every bruise into art. Greatness for him was never granted. It was carved bone by bone out of hunger, humiliation, and an unyielding faith that if pain was all he had, then pain would be enough. Pacino's metamorphosis from hungry outsider to cinematic titan was forged not in comfort, but in agony, and sealed forever in the furnace of The Godfather. The studio dismissed him as too small, too unknown, too dark. They wanted someone easier to sell. But Francis Ford Coppola, clinging to his own job by a thread, saw what no one else did: a volcano hiding behind silence. "One wrong move and I'd vanish," Pacino would later recall, his voice still carrying the tremor of that fear. Coppola risked everything on one scene. The restaurant assassination, filmed early, desperate to prove his faith wasn't madness. Under the low hum of fluorescent lights, Pacino sat perfectly still, eyes hollow, breath shallow, a man becoming the monster he swore he'd never be. And when he finally pulled the trigger, Hollywood stopped breathing. His stillness roared louder than the gunfire. His restraint shattered every doubt. When the scene ended, he limped off set, his knee torn, his tendons screaming, the pain dulled only by injections and willpower. Yet in that agony, a legend was born. The applause that followed was deafening. But to Pacino, it felt less like victory and more like survival. When award season came and the Academy listed him as supporting actor, not lead, he refused to attend. "They still don't see me," he told a friend quietly. The world saw triumph. Pacino felt the loneliness of being proven right too soon. And somewhere on that same set, amid the haze of cigarette smoke and studio lights, he met Diane Keaton. She was warmth where he was shadow, laughter where he was silence. Between takes, she'd tease him out of his stillness. And for the first time, he smiled without acting. No one knew it yet, but The Godfather had birthed two legends and one love that would haunt them both for life. Then came Serpico, 1973. To embody a man defying corruption, Pacino stripped himself raw. "It left me drained," he confessed later, haunted by that loneliness. He lived in isolation, during the shoot, refusing comfort, sleeping little, carrying Frank Serpico's paranoia long after the cameras stopped. Audiences saw moral courage. He carried exhaustion and silence. For every cheer, there was another night he lay awake, wondering if honesty was worth the ache. A decade later, Scarface burned him anew. Tony Montana, all rage and hunger, mirrored the darkness Pacino had spent years trying to escape. "It frightened me," he admitted, "how much of myself I saw in him." A prop explosion seared his hand. Critics scorched his soul. They called the film vulgar, tasteless, a fall from grace. He withdrew, licking wounds no headline could see. But time, that most merciless critic, turned pity into praise. Scarface rose again, reborn as a cultural anthem, its fury immortal. Pacino said nothing. He had learned that immortality has a price, and every scare is a receipt. In 1992, destiny came full circle with Scent of a Woman. Blind, furious, tender. He lived the role, walking through sets without sight, learning to move by sound, by instinct, by faith. He wanted to know the world as he knew it, he said. The performance thundered with authenticity and finally delivered him the Oscar that had eluded him for decades. Yet the victory was paradox. The statue gleamed, but he felt hollowed out, emptied by the act of carrying pain so others could believe. It wasn't triumph, it was transcendence paid for in solitude. By the mid-1990s, Pacino no longer chased fame, he sought meaning. Looking for Richard, 1996 was half confession, half resurrection, a love letter to Shakespeare and the art that saved him. 4 years later came Chinese Coffee, chosen not for prestige, but truth. That same year, he accepted the co-presidency of the Actors Studio, the sanctuary that had once kept a lost boy from freezing on Bronx nights. The boy who had slept in theaters was now their guardian. His students remember not a star, but a mentor who taught like a man still fighting for breath. Acting, he told them, is living truthfully under imaginary circumstances. He had lived that creed and bled for it. From The Godfather to Scent of a Woman, from rejection to ovation, Pacino's story was never gentle. It was fracture and fire, survival and transfiguration. To watch him was to witness a man forging light out of wounds. Proof that greatness is not what you win, but what you endure. And even after conquering the world, he did not guard fame. He guarded the flame. The same one Diane once saw, flickering behind his silence. The same one that would burn for her long after the camera stopped. Just as Al Pacino was learning that greatness could be lonely, Diane Keaton was discovering that gentleness could be power. They didn't know it yet, but every role, every heartbreak, every quiet triumph was leading them toward each other. The silence that had haunted her childhood followed Diane Keaton into the roaring chaos of New York City. It was 1966, and winter clung to Manhattan like punishment. Gray, endless, and bone-deep. Barely 20, she stepped off a Greyhound bus carrying one suitcase, 2 worn scripts, and the trembling courage of someone determined not to vanish. The first gust of wind hit her like truth, sharp, merciless, indifferent. She rented a narrow apartment on the Upper West Side, its wallpaper peeling, the radiator coughing more than heating. At night, she slept in her coat, her breath fogging the window as snow pressed against the glass. Outside, the city glittered. Inside, silence pressed harder. She learned quickly, New York was no dream. It was a trial by ice, and here, survival wasn't luck. It was art. Morning light came dull and colorless. She queued for auditions in rooms that smelled of stale coffee and hope turned sour. Too tall, too strange, not the type. The words stung worse than the cold. By noon, she was a waitress, smiling at strangers who never looked twice. By night, she sang in basements so smoky the air tasted like ash, her voice trembling above the clatter of coins in a glass jar. On the worst nights, she walked to stay warm, her shoes soaked, her pride thinner than her coat. Once, she split a sandwich with another girl from the playhouse, laughing through hunger at the absurdity of still believing in anything. The radiator coughed instead of warming, she wrote later, but I stayed because I was afraid all the time, and fear became my engine. That fear carried her through weeks of hunger, months of rejection, dinner waista and half a slice of bread. Rent was paid with pawned shoes and skipped subway fares. She wrote by candlelight when power was cut, whispering to herself, "Not yet." Some nights she pressed her hands to the frozen window just to feel something real. The city was deafening, she would say, but I had never felt more unheard. Yet beneath that silence, a stubborn ember glowed. the holy hunger that would one day feed her art. Then in 1968, after 2 years of frost and fear, came The Call Hair, a Broadway revival seeking someone raw, unpolished, painfully real. She auditioned barefoot, trembling, but alive. The director watched silent, then said, "Don't change a thing." That night, she stood beneath the stage lights, barefoot again, her heart pounding louder than the drums. The silence inside her cracked open into song. The audience didn't see perfection, they saw truth. "I built myself out of fear," she would later say. Fear was the foundation. Every no had sharpened her courage. Every cold night had built her faith, long before Oscars, before applause, before the world called her extraordinary. There was only this: a young woman walking through snow with empty pockets and a fire the cold could never kill. That is where her legend began. Not in fame, but in frost. Not in noise, but insolence that finally learned to speak. By the 1970s, the snow of New York had melted into spotlight. The silence that once wrapped Diane Keaton's life was replaced by applause so loud it echoed across the world. The Godfather came first, 1972, and with it everything changed. As Kay Adams, she stood in the shadow of Al Pacino's Michael Corleone, a woman who loved, lost, and bore witness to P's price. The role gave her more than fame. It gave her the voice she'd been fighting for since childhood. Then came Annie Hall, 1977, the role that would define her and an era. The awkward laugh, the androgynous charm, the fearless honesty. None of it was act. It was Diane. For the first time, Hollywood didn't just see beauty. It saw truth wrapped in imperfection. At 31, she held her Oscar beneath the white-hot glare of the stage lights. And for a fleeting moment, she thought she'd finally been seen. But when she came home that night, she placed the statue on her kitchen counter, looked around the empty room, and whispered, "Is this what it feels like to be real?" Every spotlight casts a shadow, and hers was already growing. Success for Diane became a gilded cage. Each script arrived with the same unspoken challenge. Can you ever be that good again? Fame had its own weather, dazzling, cruel, and impossible to predict. She memorized lines long after crews went home, hands shaking from exhaustion, eyes stinging from sleeplessness. "I didn't sleep," she later admitted. "I was terrified to stop." Between takes, she hid in dressing rooms, rewriting scenes no one had asked her to. The higher she climbed, the thinner the air became. Her laughter, once spontaneous, started to sound rehearsed. Even joy became performance. There were nights she drove through Los Angeles with the windows down, letting the cold burn her cheeks, trying to remember what it felt like to simply exist. "I thought success would make me whole," she said once. Instead, it gave me permission to break in public. When Red's 1981 came, directed by Warren Beatty, she poured herself out completely. The role devoured her mind, her heart, her sleep. "I remember crying in the car after filming," she confessed. "Not because I was sad, but because I had nothing left to give." The world cheered. She felt hollow. The candle had burned too beautifully to survive its own flame. The storm quieted, as all storms do. The mid-1980s brought films that faltered. The Little Drummer Girl, 1984, sank under the weight of expectation. Critics turned cold. Box offices colder. "Everyone thought I was still on top," she said later. But inside, I was slipping. She disappeared for a time, not in defeat, but in self-preservation. She turned down roles worth millions. The Hollywood that once chased her moved on to younger faces. But Diane had learned something the others hadn't. The applause fades, but the work saves you. She wrote, she directed, she built. Slowly she found peace not in fame, but in creation itself. Because for Diane Keaton, success was never the destination. It was the endurance, the courage to show up when no one's watching. Every sleepless night, Every trembling hand, every whispered doubt became part of her legend. The woman the world adored for her laughter had built that laughter from fear. The woman praised for freedom had earned it through chains. And though history will remember the Oscars, the roles, the glory, what truly defined her were the hours unseen. The rewrites at 3 a.m., the tears behind locked doors, the choice to begin again when the world had stopped looking. In the end, she discovered that the brightest lights are also the loneliest. Yet she never cursed them because they had shown her who she truly was. That was her triumph. That was her art. And now, somewhere beyond the noise, the silence that once broke her has finally come back. Not as punishment, but as peace. By the early 1970s, both had fought their way from silence and fire to the edge of greatness. And it was on that edge that they found each other. It was 1971, and the world did not yet know the storm it was about to witness. On a dimly lit sound stage in New York, where the smell of dust and film reels hung in the air, two young actors waited for their cue. One restless, one radiant, both still unknown. He was Al Pacino, a wiry boy from the Bronx with eyes that carried too many winters. She was Diane Keaton, a California dream wrapped in linen and sunlight. Her laughter, the only thing that seemed to move the still air. When their eyes met for the first time, something unspoken shifted. Not fireworks, but recognition, like two exiles realizing they'd been walking toward each other all their lives. He was supposed to be playing Michael Corleone, a man learning how to bury his heart. But in that moment, Al forgot the script. The way she smiled, hesitant, curious, endlessly kind, felt too real. Diane, watching him fumble for words between takes, saw not a co-star, but a man who wore his solitude like armor. Later, she would say, "There was something so sad in him. I wanted to make him laugh," and she did. Between scenes, she teased him, called him Sonny in that soft, teasing lilt. And he, the boy who rarely smiled, began to. They were opposites made to collide. He was fire, raw and untamed. She was silence, luminous and patient. Together they balanced like music and breath. Between takes they shared sandwiches on the curb, the hum of New York traffic replacing orchestras. She told him about her mother, the pageants, the silence of home. He told her about the Bronx, the hunger, the nights he'd slept in theaters because dreams were cheaper than rent. The director called action, but the real magic happened when the cameras weren't rolling. Two souls learning each other's language through laughter, glances, and pauses that lingered a beat too long. The chemistry between them began to bleed into the film. Every time Michael looked at Kay, it wasn't acting. It was Al looking at Diane, caught between fear and wonder. Even the crew whispered about it. How their scenes needed no retakes. How the air around them seemed charged. When the film wrapped, neither could say goodbye properly. They stood in the doorway as if leaving would break the spell. She finally smiled, the kind of smile that forgives the world, and said, "You'll call, right?" He nodded, but his silence said more than words ever could. Neither of them knew it yet. But that quiet promise, half heartbreak, was the beginning of everything. The Godfather would make them stars. But before fame, before the applause, there was only this. Two young hearts, luminous and trembling, finding in each other a reason to believe that love could exist even in the shadows. Fame came like a sunrise. Slow, golden, unstoppable. The Godfather changed everything. Overnight, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton were no longer two hungry souls trading lines between takes. They were faces the world could not forget. Reporters chased them through airports, flashbulbs exploding like fireworks. Critics wrote about their chemistry as if it were divine. They don't act, one review, they remember. But behind the noise and the lights, something quieter was happening. Two weary spirits finding refuge in one another, as though the universe had conspired to let them meet. While Hollywood roared, they whispered. When news of their closeness began to spread, the world fell under their spell. Magazine covers crowned them the soulmates of the silver screen. Fans wrote letters not to the stars, but to the idea of them. Believing their love made all of cinema's illusions feel possible again. Pacino and Keaton people would sigh as if the words themselves meant hope. They were the embodiment of what everyone secretly longed for. Passion without spectacle, fame without vanity, love that still felt human. To millions, they weren't actors. They were proof that even under the glare of Hollywood, something pure could still bloom. They weren't glamorous in the way the world expected stars to be. Their love was clumsy, domestic, stubbornly human. He was still the boy from the Bronx who misplaced his keys and carried hunger in his eyes. She was the woman who laughed too loud in restaurants, spilling coffee just to make him smile. They wandered through Central Park at dusk, sharing a paper cup of coffee, their hands brushing as if afraid to hold too tightly. "We could disappear right now," she'd tease, and he'd grin, the city lights flickering in his pupils. In her little apartment on 68th Street, they cooked burnt pasta, argued about movies, read poetry aloud until dawn. Sometimes she'd fall asleep on his chest while Sinatra sighed through the radio. Other nights they spoke in that rare, holy silence between two people who no longer need words. With her, Pacino once said, "I felt seen in a way that scared me because I didn't think I deserved it." Between The Godfather Part II and Dog Day Afternoon, their lives spun faster than time itself. Red carpets, interviews, hotel rooms, applause. She'd slip love notes into his scripts. He'd leave Polaroids of her on her pillow, scrolled with lines from Nuda. "Don't forget to eat," she'd whisper into the phone before sleep, her voice soft against the distance. They built a fragile kind of paradise between flights and fame. Imperfect, but real. He loved her cautiously, afraid his fire might burn her. She loved him recklessly, believing her light could soften every wound he carried. "I used to wait for him to call," Diane would later confess. And when he did, everything else disappeared. To her, he was the stillness after applause. To him, she was the light that made the fire bearable. Together they were balanced. The storm and the calm, the fire and the dawn. There were nights when love felt endless. A summer evening in Los Angeles, the air thick with orange blossoms. They danced barefoot in her living room. No music, just the rhythm of two hearts learning to breathe as one. "Promise me," she whispered. "We'll always have this." He didn't answer with words. He kissed her, and in that silence she thought she heard forever exhale. But even the brightest flame throws a shadow. The more the world celebrated them, the more reality began to intrude. Missed calls, empty beds. Two lives stretched across oceans and premieres. Success became a third presence between them. Bright, jealous, unrelenting. "He was my dream," she would later say softly, "and I held on to it even when a third." He too felt the distance, but said nothing, as if silence could protect what love no longer could. At the height of their glory, when their names burned on mares from New York to Rome, they were still beneath the silk and the spotlight. Just two fragile souls trying to hold on to the peace they'd once found in the quiet of a soundstage. For all the noise that surrounded them, their love remained tender, trembling, achingly human, too pure to be perfect, too beautiful to survive the weight of forever. And perhaps that was the cruel miracle of it. They believed with all their hearts that forever had finally found them, never knowing how close forever was to ending. The fall did not come with thunder. It came quietly, like dusk, swallowing a perfect afternoon. From 1972 to 1981, for nearly 9 years, they had outrun time itself, clinging to a love too fragile for the world that worshipped them. He was 32 when it began. She, 27, two rising stars whose lives had just been lit by the Godfather's golden fire. But even the strongest hearts can stretch only so far before they begin to tear. Fame, distance, fear. The same forces that once lifted them into legend began to erode what they'd built. For Al Pacino and Diane Keaton, it wasn't betrayal that ended them, but exhaustion. Two souls too weary from loving so deeply for so long. It began with small fractures, missed calls, canceled dinners, letters that went unanswered. He was filming Bobby Deerfield in Europe. She was in New York working on Annie Hall. The time zones grew heavier than miles. He'd disappear into his work, she once said softly. And I learned not to ask where he went inside himself. She wrote him often. Long letters scented faintly of her perfume. Pages filled with warmth and worry. Sometimes he answered, sometimes he didn't. The man who once shared every silence now felt unreachable. As if fame had built invisible walls around him. She waited, believing it was just another season, that love would circle back like it always had. But some seasons end without warning. When he returned home, the air was thick with the echo of her absence. Her scarf on the chair, her laughter folded into memory. On the kitchen table sat a half-finished cup of coffee, still faintly warm. Love paused mid-breath. By the time The Godfather Part II wrapped in 1974, the distance between them had already begun to turn to stone. On screen, Kay left Michael Corleone in tears. Off-screen, Diane felt the same fracture splitting her heart. There's a moment, she later confessed, when I looked at him during filming and realized I wasn't acting anymore. The line between fiction and truth blurred until love itself felt rehearsed. He feared permanence. She longed for it. I told him I wanted marriage, she said years later, her voice trembling like the memory of rain. He said love was enough. She smiled when he said it because she wanted to believe him. But deep down, she knew forever can't live on May. That night, sometime around 1981, she packed quietly. No shouting, no storm, only the dull rhythm of zippers and heartbeats. The room glowed faintly with the amber of a streetlight, her shadow stretching across the wall like something leaving for good. Outside, rain began to fall, first soft, then merciless. Her coat brushed against her knees as she turned to him one last time. I can't keep waiting for you to want me completely, she whispered. He stood by the window, paralyzed between pride and love, watching her blur into the downpour until her white silhouette dissolved. The door closed softly, the sound of something sacred ending. When asked years later, Pacino said quietly, I wasn't ready for her love. She wanted a life, and I was still trying to survive mine. Diane, with that half-smile that always carried a tremor of sorrow, would later say, he broke my heart. But he didn't mean to. And that was the cruelest truth. Neither meant to hurt the other. They just didn't know how not to. Hollywood woke to the news as if mourning a death. If even Al and Diane couldn't make it, one headline sighed, what hope do the rest of us have? Fans sent letters of disbelief. Others lingered outside theaters, clutching their photographs, whispering they were the last true love story. But life kept moving. Diane buried herself in work. Reds 1981, Looking for Mr. Goodbar 1977, Baby Boom 1987. Films that carried her longing in every breath. I used every bit of pain, she said quietly. Every tear was real. Al hurled himself into his characters. Serpico, Scarface, Frank Slade. Each one a vessel for the love he'd lost. After her, he confessed, I put everything into my roles. Maybe because I couldn't put it anywhere else. Years passed, decades, yet they never stopped orbiting each other. When they reunited in 1990 to film The Godfather Part III, Diane was 44, Al 50. She admitted she was nervous, not about acting, but about feeling. When I looked at him again, she said, it was like no time had passed and all the time in the world had. On set, the old rhythm returned, the glances that lingered too long, the silences that said too much. The cameras rolled, but it wasn't Kay and Michael anymore. It was Al and Diane, two ghosts walking through the ruins of what once was. I always thought we'd find our way back, she whispered later. But life isn't a movie. We don't always get another take. Years later, when asked if he regretted not marrying her, Pacino paused for a long time. Regret? He said at last. Every day she was the one that got away, and I let her. The silence that followed spoke louder than confession. Their love did not end. It transformed into art, into memory, into the H behind his eyes and the laughter behind hers. It became the invisible thread that tied their legacies together, the pulse beneath every role, the truth behind every performance. They had loved each other for 9 years, long enough to build a life too short to finish it. Theirs was not a story of perfection, but of fragility, proof that even the most beautiful things can break and still remain holy. And perhaps that's what they left us with. That love, no matter how fierce, cannot save us from ourselves. Sometimes the bravest act of love is to let go before you destroy what's left to save. For decades, fans would still whisper their names together, Pacino and Keaton, not as tragedy, but as proof that even broken love can echo forever. Because some endings don't fade. They just change form from touch to memory to legend. And now, at last, the story has come full circle. On October 11th, 2025, Diane Keaton, the woman whose laughter once lit the silver screens of the world, slipped away as quietly as she had once entered them. After years of facing skin cancer with the same grace, wit, and courage that defined her art, she took her final bow at 79. The news arrived with the sunrise, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though the world itself had forgotten how to breathe. Los Angeles woke beneath a gentler sky that morning, the kind of soft gold light she loved to film in, as if even the sun chose to dim its brilliance in her honor. Across the world, tributes rose like a tide of gratitude. Fans left flowers outside theaters that once echoed with her laughter. Directors who had called her muse wrote that she'd been a compass for truth. Actors, young and old, spoke through tears about how she made them braver, how she showed them that imperfection could be luminous. Social media became a constellation of memories. Clips of Annie Hall's laughter, stills from The Godfather, quiet moments from Reds and Something's Got to Give. Every post read like a love letter to a woman who had never played a role she didn't first live. But it wasn't only Hollywood that mourned her. It was everyone who had ever felt seen because of her. Her family released a short statement, tender and simple. She left the world the way she lived in it, full of light. In New York, Broadway theaters dimmed their lights. In Los Angeles, film reels paused for a minute of silence. And somewhere, in an old movie house where the seats still creak and the air smells faintly of dust and popcorn, an audience watched Annie Halligan laughing, crying, remembering. She had once said that art is how we stay alive even after we're gone. And in that sense, Diane Keaton will never leave us. Her voice lingers in every frame, her courage in every story that dares to tell the truth. The woman who turned awkwardness into beauty, silence into strength, and loneliness into laughter has simply taken her bow. Not to vanish, but to remind us that even when the curtain falls, the light she left behind still flickers. Somewhere her laughter still echoes, soft, eternal, and full of life. For Al Pacino, now 85, the silence was unbearable. After half a century of knowing her laughter, the thought of a world without it felt unreal. A close friend said that when the call came, he stood by the window of his New York apartment for a long time, watching the river shimmer in the early light. She had that glow, he whispered. Even the sky feels dimmer now. Reporters reached out for comment, but Pacino gave none. Only later, through a short statement, came a few trembling words. She was my friend, my light, and a part of me that time could never take. I will love her always. Those who knew them understood what he meant. Their story, the love that once burned bright through The Godfather and lived on quietly for decades, had never really ended. It had simply changed shape, finding new life in memory, in art, in the invisible connection that even age and distance could not erase. Theirs was not a love story that ended in marriage or forever, but in something rarer, mutual reverence. And now, with her gone, the silence between them had finally become eternal. All around the world, people remembered her not just as an actress, but as an idea, the embodiment of honesty, humor, and unguarded humanity. Annie Hall, Reds, Baby Boom. The characters she played became mirrors for those who had once felt invisible. She taught generations that imperfection could be beautiful, that vulnerability was not weakness, but art. As the tributes continued, one line seemed to echo louder than all the rest. She never pretended to be perfect, and that's what made her unforgettable. At sunset in Los Angeles, fans gathered outside the TCL Chinese Theater, leaving flowers, letters, and Polaroids from her films. Someone placed a single wide-brimmed hat, her signature, beside a candle. The flame flickered once, then steadied as if refusing to die. Somewhere across the country, Al Pacino sat in quiet reflection. He did not need to speak. Those who had followed their story for decades already knew the words that would never leave his heart. He had once said, "She was the one that got away, and I let her." Now those words felt less like regret and more like a benediction, because love like theirs does not fade with time. It simply learns to live without form. Diane Keaton's passing is not just the end of a life. It is the closing of an era, a reminder that brilliance can be tender, that laughter can be brave, and that love, when true, can survive even silence. Perhaps that is the legacy they leave behind. That love, even when unfinished, can still be eternal. That sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that end with a whisper, not applause. And that somewhere beyond the noise, a woman who once filled the world with light has simply taken that light somewhere higher, where it will never dim again. Farewell, Diane Keaton. You once said that love doesn't always last, but it always leaves something behind. And now, as the world grieves your passing, we finally understand what you meant. What you and Al Pacino shared was never about forever. It was about truth. Two souls who met in the chaos and built something holy from their wounds. He carries your laughter still. The world carries your light. And somewhere between silence and memory, the love you gave continues to breathe. You showed us that love, even when it breaks, is never wasted. It becomes the echo that keeps us alive. So rest now, Diane, not in darkness, but in the soft glow of everything you once illuminated. The story isn't over. It just changed form. And that was the untold story of two Hollywood legends, Al Pacino and Diane Keaton. Their love, their struggles, and their legacy remind us that behind every star, there's a story waiting to be heard. If you love diving into this world of Hollywood truths, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Stay tuned to FameFlash, where the glitz, the glamour, and the untold secrets of Hollywood come alive. Because every story deserves its spotlight.